there's like feeling something that I appreciate, there's like a pang. Does that make sense? There's like a pang of pain. It's a pain. And I'm wondering if that's...
Well, we would say that's a wavering within the focus. In other words, the example that our friend offered earlier of Tiger Woods, who is tuned in and winning and feeling good, and yet displayed real discord at a moment of out of the vortex. Well, doesn't it follow that the more you are in, the more you freak out when you're out? In other words, it just follows. When you are accustomed to someone who is not commonly in the vortex, sort of accepts the out of the vortex life. They're tough, they buck up, they endure, they strive and struggle. And so what you're doing, as you tune yourself to the power of source, then you don't have to try to physically hold and maintain the control and struggle as those outside of the vortex do. We want to say to you that it's like if you're in the vortex and in and in and in and in. So you're soaring and joyful. Your emotions move from feeling interested to feeling elated to feeling content to feeling peaceful. If you are moving around in the vortex like that, there's quite a range of what you would call descriptive words from inside the vortex. But in other words, even from hope to belief to knowing is all on the verge and in the vortex. Knowing is really in there. Believing is in there too, but not as substantially in there. So there's quite a range within the vortex. But if you're really in and you've been in and you've been basking, and then someone brings you a piece of information that is nowhere near a vibrational match to that, the question might be, well, how would law of attraction bring you a piece of information if you're in the vortex? And we say, because you have a willingness and even a desire to interact with your world at large, and there are things that happen. So is it possible that you could be in the vortex and your attention could be called to something that would abruptly take you out of the vortex? And we say, of course it's possible. Now, in time, you may be in your physical body and you may be so accustomed to focusing upon the well-being, and you may become so solution-oriented, you may become so knowing that every problem just produces a solution so that the problems don't even faze you because you're so solution-oriented. But there is always a range of focus, and that's what you're describing. If we were standing in your physical shoes, we would never say, it is my intent to be 100% of the time in the vortex, because if that had been your intention, you would have remained non-physical like us. You said, I'll go forth and explore contrast, because in the exploration there is more substantial, more specific expansion, and I want that. Most people, when we visit with you and you tune to us and you become like so many of you, like Esther and Jerry, where you really care about being in the vortex and it is your dominant intention to be in the vortex, if you are in there 70% of the time, you are doing extremely well in relationship to most people on the planet. Most people are in the vortex. Most people that you run across are in the vortex 1 to 5% of the time. And you recognize it when you see them because they're more likely to complain and more likely to make fun and more likely to push against, more likely to be negative. Look at which movies are blockbusters and which movies aren't. In other words, the public at large is predominantly not in the vortex, and so they can count their moments of elation usually on 10 fingers. There was that time in Malibu and that time on the beach, and there was that. In other words, they're highlights. They call them highlights, where someone in the vortex has a hard time depicting highlights because it all lights up in a high way. You say. So being aware of how you feel and wanting to feel good, and then having conscious ability to guide yourself there. What we love to see is someone willing to get out in the world and mix it up. Someone willing to explore for the purpose of having the new idea be born, but then be clear enough and wise enough to know by the feeling in their own solar plexus whether they are sustaining outside the vortex or whether they are working to be in the vortex. In other words, awareness and control of emotion is the freedom that you all really seek. In other words, we don't think that a negative thought hurts you so much that you're not willing to endure it. But there is an eroding of who you are until in time, it just isn't bright and brilliant and beautiful for you in the way that you want it to be. And that's why you want to tune yourself in. Jerry and Esther were in a campground in Boston last week. And a little girl with her older sister came bouncing by. The little girl was 3 or 4 years old, and she had a ponytail which exaggerated the bounce in her step, and her shoes lighted up when she stepped also, which accentuated the bounce in her step. And she was just so joyful in this moment. She was running to keep up with her sister, but skipping to keep up, and every now and again she'd just spin while she ran so that Jerry and Esther could see the full smile on her face. It was like she was shouting to the boundaries of this boundaryless universe her joy in being alive. And Jerry and Esther were parked there. The street went all the way around them, a very small little, there were several parking places, and the street went all the way around, and the little girl went around 2 or 3 times around this little road, and Esther just kept running from window to window to window to window to window to try to keep this little joyous being in her view as long as possible, because she was exhibiting her joy at life. And that's what you're reaching for. Did that little girl maintain it? Probably not. Esther didn't follow her around all day. It is probable that there were squabbles in that day, and moments of being tired in that day, and moments of being out of the vortex in that day, even as this pure, positive, joyful, seeking child. So that child, we would say, in the vortex, vibrationally speaking, was in the vortex 85% of her days. High percentage. Her sister, who was about 2 years older, 40%. Her parents, 5%. So each of you gets to decide. Train yourself, train yourself, train yourself. Get in and then practice the vibration of it. Affirm it. See, you can't push against not being in the vortex. It just keeps you out of the vortex. If you're not in the vortex and you're mad about not being in the vortex, and you're disappointed about not being in the vortex, and discouraged about not being in the vortex, and determined to get in the vortex, and mad that you're not in the vortex, and aware of other people who are in the vortex, and irritated that they're in and you're not in, and wanting to be in the vortex, and determined to get in the vortex, and irritated about not being in the vortex, and want to be in the vortex, and wish you never even heard of the vortex, and tired of striving for the vortex, and aware that the vortex, and then in the vortex. When you find yourself, no matter how you get there, in there, that's when we would put on the steam to do the work. We would not do out of the vortex work, because when you're not in the vortex and you want to be in the vortex, and you're trying to get in the vortex from not being in the vortex, you just practice not being in the vortex. So what you do is let life, and it will, take you into the vortex. In other words, no one could have watched that child bounding around that campground without being spun into the web. She was demonstrating a vortex, for heaven's sake. She was going around them and around them and around them and around them and around them. Jerry and Esther, remember, a few years ago, they bought a large piece of property in Texas where their office and home now is. And their property butted up against another man's property. And he had a tennis court and a greenhouse, and his greenhouse was on their property, which they didn't mind. They weren't going to ask him to move it, but they wanted to clear the right-of-way for passage, and it had been unoccupied, and he was not happy about them buying the property and wanting to use the access. And so he was doing everything in his power to be obstinate. And Jerry and Esther were trying to appease him and trying to find out how they could make it work in a way that would please him. But there was no pleasing this man. He was just determined to make trouble. And so when Jerry and Esther hired a crew to clear this right-of-way, he came out with his shotgun and told them to leave. And they did. And so now Jerry and Esther are having a conversation with him. And the man who sold the property to Jerry and Esther and this man, not with his shotgun, they're having a conversation. And the man was just antagonistic. He was just belligerent. He was having none of it. And Jerry and Esther were trying to explain to him that they needed access to that piece of property. That's one of the reasons that the access existed, and he was having none of it. And the man who Jerry and Esther had bought the property from had brought his dog along. And the dog was in the vortex. And none of these humans were, not one of them, not one of them. Esther stood in disbelief. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man who sold the property was as ornery as the other man. The man who was antagonistic was having none of any of them, and not one of the humans was in the vortex. And so the dog jumped into the swimming pool and swam in circles, and then came out of the swimming pool and proceeded to shake himself off on every one of them. He ran around them and 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 around them, put wet dog hair water all over them, and did it so long that all of them were laughing. All of them were laughing. He spun his web of alignment around these humans who were confused about life. They laughed, they shook hands, they agreed, and it was done. Now, you're getting way more than you bargained for here, because you're commonly in alignment. In other words, you understand about the vortex and you know how to be in there. What we want you to understand is that you get to set your own standards, and what happens is once you accept the validity of this vortex, this vibrational reality, and once you feel how it feels to be in it and not, and in it and not, and in it and not. And by the way, it keeps moving because life keeps taking you into higher and higher vibrations. So rather than trying to figure out what percentage of the time you're in it or what percentage of the time you're not in it, just set your intention to feel as good as you can possibly feel. And what you'll begin to discover is you cannot think an out of the vortex thought and an in the vortex thought at the same time. You're just not doing it. Your vibration is where it is, and if your vibration is high and then you change the subject, you're going to feel a drop, and that's what you were describing. Or if your vibration is low and you change the subject, you can feel the uptake of it too. In other words, show yourself that you have the ability to focus yourself into alignment with who you are, and then just practice it, practice it, practice it, practice it. And most of all, don't ever get down on yourself for focusing out of the vortex. It's all right. It's a step one moment. Just don't make a career out of step one. Most of the people that you know are making a career out of step one moments. It's a rare human who really deliberately works to be in vibrational alignment. And when they do, you call them Tiger Woods, king of the golf game. Or when they do, you call them a brilliant genius musician or painter or author. In other words, you call them joyful one or joyful child or joyful dog. In other words, it's easy to figure them out. And it's easy to figure it out with you too.
Thank
Enough?
you. Yes, thank you so much.
Yes, indeed.